SBD days where you train squat, bench press, and deadlift all in the same session have gotten pretty popular in the powerlifting world, but here's some things that you might want to consider if you're thinking about adding some in. The main argument in favor of SBD days tends to be that they're really specific. If the sport of powerlifting is doing squat, bench press, and deadlift all on the same day at the meet, then a lot of people think that, oh, well, maybe I should train that way because it's super specific to meets. It's probably a really good way to get better at powerlifting. But the reality is specificity as a general quality is more meant to be a minimum threshold. Something needs to be specific enough in order to carry over to the task that you're trying to get better at. It's not necessarily something where more specificity is always better. So a great example, let's draw an analogy real quick. If you were trying to get better at taking a test, you would probably want to learn and study and then take the exam rather than just take the exam over and over and over again. Or even in a like sports kind of setting, if you were trying to get better at basketball, you probably wouldn't just play a ton of basketball games. You would want some of that to also be practiced specifically on shooting, passing, drills, things that will help you actually improve your qualities and get better at basketball rather than just doing tons of games. So same thing in powerlifting. We want the best training that will help develop the qualities that we need, as opposed to just doing something as specific as possible to meet day super often. Here's why SBD days may not be the best training in terms of developing those qualities that we actually want. Strength has two main factors to it. It's going to be the muscle size, and then also your ability to utilize and recruit all of that all at once, which is kind of, you can lump together like technical skill on the movement as well as neural efficiency. So your nervous system's ability to recruit that muscle fiber and like coordinate the movement to do it well. Both of those things come from lifting heavy and practicing the competition lift. The muscle size is probably best developed when training muscles close to failure and through a fairly full range of motion. Most of the time, our competition lifts, the squat, the bench press, the deadlift, are not the best way to put on muscle mass, because in a powerlifting sort of setting, we're trying to limit range of motion so that we can lift more weight. Wider grips on bench press, sumo deadlifts to shorten the range of motion, things like that. And generally, it's not one muscle being taken close to failure. When you fail a really heavy or really hard set of squats, you're just kind of generally like struggling to maintain your torso position, struggling to maintain your hip position. You can't quite produce enough force to like keep it going or stay in the right spot. It's not necessarily like, oh, I really squeezed out all of the output that I could from my quads or my glutes or something like that. So accessory exercises play an important role in your training because they let you more isolate a certain muscle group and take it really close to failure and develop that muscle mass that we need as a component of developing strength. Accessory exercises are often neglected on SBD days because people are either only doing the competition lifts or those are taking up so much of their training time and energy that there's just not that much left at the end for accessory exercises. So this is why SBD days may not be the best in terms of addressing the muscle mass and size component of strength, which, if you're not fully convinced yet, here's some further evidence for why that really matters. Here's two studies. The first one was looking at competitive powerlifters and found strong correlations between not just muscular size and strength, but also increases in muscular size and increases in strength. The second study was looking at the correlation between size and strength as well, and they suggested that for every kilogram of muscle mass, you could reasonably expect that to be comparable to 5 to 8 kilograms on your squat and deadlift, and 3 to 5 kilograms on your bench press. So if we convert that to pounds and scale that number up, that's saying if you added 20 pounds of muscle mass, you could reasonably expect to add 100 to 160 pounds on both your squat and deadlift, and 60 to 100 pounds on your bench press. So that's massive. Also, if we just think about trends amongst top lifters, most of the world-class powerlifters are jacked. They're pretty on par with the size of a professional bodybuilder, They're just not as lean because they're not about to step on stage. A couple examples: Hunter Henderson and Brianni Terry, both females that set all-time world records fairly recently, hopped over to bodybuilding and won an IFBB pro card. It was pretty easy for them to hop back and forth and be super successful in both sports because they already had a ton of muscle mass in order to be successful in powerlifting. So muscle mass is really important, and SBD days may not address that part very well, but what about the other component, the neural efficiency and technical skills side? SBD days can work okay for this, but if you are starting to do lots of SBD days per week, like some of these IPF lifters are talking about doing 4, 5, 6 SBD days per week, you start to see a problem there as well, because as you increase frequency more and more and more, the intensity has to go lower and lower and lower because there's only so much total training stress that you can handle per week and recover from. And as the intensity drops, it might not even be worth doing, because powerlifting as a sport is about trying to get good at lifting maximal weights. If you're training at lower and lower intensities, it's probably not going to be the best way to actually get stronger, and it's probably not the best way to practice the technical skills, because there's a certain level of intensity necessary for that to actually transfer over to maximal loads. It's pretty much impossible to draw one hard, fast line as to what that cutoff for productive training is, but I would generally say things should be at least RPE of 6 or 4 less reps in reserve, and probably at least 70% of your 1 rep max if you want those sets of those squat, bench, and deadlift to transfer over to maximal weights. And oftentimes, if you're seeing the training frequency, the amount of times that you squat, bench, or deadlift per week go above around 2 or 3, then some of those sessions start having to get really, really easy, and some of those sets are going to start creeping below that threshold and are probably not actually that productive anymore. So I would rather see someone have lower training frequencies with higher intensities than do super high frequency and then just have lots of those sets be really low intensity that probably aren't actually doing anything, just so that they can fluff up their training frequency higher and higher. So is there a time and a place for having an SBD day in your training? Absolutely. There is one SBD day per week with the University of Alabama and Huntsville's collegiate powerlifting team that I coach, so that I can see their squat, their bench press, and their deadlift all on the one in-person practice day that we have as a team. But my biggest problem with SBD days is when people start trying to do multiple per week. And you may be thinking, surely no one would fill all their training with SBD days. But people are. That's the trend that's becoming increasingly popular, especially amongst these circles of IPF lifters. So I think part of that is coming from some famous lifters being fairly successful with this sort of approach. Agata Sitko is probably the most famous example of this because she does 6 SBD days per week, and she's a phenomenal lifter. And while I still don't think this is the best way for her to be training, she can potentially get away with it because of a couple different factors working in her favor. So the first one is she's pretty short, and she uses technique that minimizes her range of motion, like a really wide grip on bench press, a really wide stance on sumo deadlifts. So her total distance that she has to move the bar is potentially half to a third of that of some taller individuals with different technique. And that starts to add up over the course of multiple sets and multiple workouts. So she can potentially handle more volume and more frequency because of this, as well as the fact that she is a drug-tested, smaller body weight female. And all of these factors tend to reduce the absolute load, the amount of weight on the bar, compared to, say, an untested lifter who was on PEDs, who was a heavier body weight, or a male. So if we compare her to the polar opposite, Colton Engelbrecht, the biggest all-time total in powerlifting, he's an untested male with a much heavier body weight. He only squats, benches, and deadlifts 1 time per week, and they're not on the same day, they're spread out throughout the week. Or Eric Lillybridge, another famous example of a super strong, very heavy male. His family is famous for either squatting or deadlifting heavy each week, so it's around 14 days in between their heavy squats or their heavy deadlifts. So if we compare these two, factors like the absolute load on the bar determined by your size, your sex, your drug use or drug-free status, as well as your experience level, your age, things like that, that factor into how much total weight you're lifting. Certain people will be able to lift more frequently than others, based on the absolute load on the bar, as well as the distance that the bar has to move per set, potentially also factoring in. So for Agatha, it makes sense that she can potentially get away with this, whereas other world-class lifters of different factors are not doing this sort of style. And depending on you as the listener, how you fall in terms of those various factors determines how frequently you should be training those lifts. But the reality is most people are going to fall somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 times per week on bench press, and potentially 1 to 2 times per week on squat and deadlift. So if you were trying to distribute those throughout the week, that could look like doing your main squat and your secondary deadlift, and then your other lower body day being your main deadlift and your secondary squat. There's 2 of each per week. And then you also have 1 upper body day, that's your main bench press, and 1 upper body day, that's your secondary bench press. So if you're training 4 times per week, that may work very well for you. If you only train 3 times per week and you wanted to keep that same twice per week frequency on all the lifts, then that might look like 1 lower body day, 1 upper body day, and then 1 SBD day. So again, SBD days are not inherently evil or bad. If you need to have one in order to optimally distribute your training frequency across the amount of total days that you have available to train, it's totally fine. It's just there's nothing inherently special about SBD days that make them the best way to train, and I certainly wouldn't do a bunch of them per week because you're probably better off with lower frequencies and higher intensities and a lot of accessory exercises to really prioritize putting on muscle mass. If you have any questions about this or other powerlifting things, feel free to reach out and I would be happy to chat. Also, you can visit liftpremier.com for free resources such as my sumo deadlift guide or my guide on how to train with time constraints. Or if you're interested in coaching, you can also check out the coaching page there at liftpremier.com.